Welcome to the History Maps podcast. The year is 789. A royal tax collector stands on the shore of the Isle of Portland, watching three foreign merchant ships pull onto the beach. He mounts his horse, intending to ride down, greet the merchants, and collect the standard customs duty for the King of Wessex. He has no idea that the men stepping off those ships are not merchants.
No, they certainly are not.
He has no idea. He is about to become the first recorded casualty of an era-defining invasion, and he absolutely has no idea that these seafarers will completely rewrite the economic, political, and literal DNA of the British Isles.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are taking a really massive deep dive into a core part of our English history series today.
Yeah, we really have a towering stack of sources in front of us for this one. I mean, we're looking at contemporary historical texts. We have these highly detailed archaeological reports.
With the isotopic analyses of human remains, right?
Exactly. And the actual legal codes that were enforced during the era. Right. So our mission here is to give you, the listener, a comprehensive shortcut to understanding the Viking Age. We are moving way beyond that popular image of, just hit-and-run raiders with axes. We want to examine a fundamental transformation of a massive geographical region.
And to fully grasp the magnitude of that transformation, we really cannot start on the beaches of Wessex. We have to trace the origin of those ships back across the North Sea to Scandinavia. We have to address the underlying mechanics of why these populations, living in present-day Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, decided to leave their homelands in the first place.
Because setting sail in an open wooden boat across freezing waters is, it's not a casual undertaking.
No, not at all. It requires a profound catalyst to get people to do that.
I often think of 8th century Scandinavia as this massive pressure cooker. I mean, the historical narrative often portrays these raiders as men simply seeking adventure. But adventure doesn't mobilize tens of thousands of people over centuries. There had to be severe environmental and political limits pushing the lid off from the inside.
Right, and the sources categorize these internal pressures as push factors. So the political landscape of Scandinavia prior to the Viking Age was highly fragmented. It was this complex mosaic of petty kings and local chieftains, and each one held small territories and maintained their own retinues of loyal warriors.
Just a bunch of small warlords, basically.
Exactly. But as we approach the late 8th and 9th centuries, we see this brutal process of political centralization taking hold. The most prominent example is Harald Fairhair's campaign to unite Norway under a single centralized crown.
Which means a lot of powerful men suddenly found themselves, entirely out of power.
Oh, absolutely. A chieftain who previously ruled his own valley, collected his own taxes, commanded his own men, he was suddenly presented with an ultimatum. You either submit to a high king or you lose everything. And many chose not to submit.
So they were stripped of their traditional lands and their social status.
Yeah, consequently, you have an entire newly disenfranchised warrior elite, complete with their armed followers, effectively exiled. They were forced out onto the water to seek new territories, wealth, and a place to reestablish their authority.
But the pressure wasn't just at the top of the social hierarchy, right? It wasn't only disgruntled warlords setting sail.
No, not at all.
Because the records and the demographic modeling we have show severe pressures at the lower levels of society as well. I'm looking at the agricultural data for Norway, and the arable land is just incredibly scarce. I mean, it's a landscape dominated by mountains and fjords.
The geography is entirely unforgiving. As the population expanded during this period, the limited supply of farmable land became a critical bottleneck, and this land scarcity collided with traditional Scandinavian inheritance patterns.
Right, the way they pass down land.
Yeah, in many of these communities, land was passed down entirely to the eldest son. And they did this to prevent estates from being divided into these unfarmable, tiny little plots.
Which leaves the second, third, and fourth sons with absolutely nothing. They have no land, no income, and really no immediate prospects for survival in an agrarian society.
Exactly. They are essentially a surplus population of young men. And this surplus population faced an even more intimate crisis. Several anthropological models derived from our sources suggest a severe imbalance in the operational sex ratio.
And this imbalance was potentially driven by a combination of powerful, wealthy men practicing polygyny, taking multiple wives and concubines, and the harsh reality of selective female infanticide.
Yeah, it's a really stark picture.
I want to pause on that because it radically shifts how we view their motivations. If a handful of wealthy chieftains are monopolizing the eligible women and there are fewer women to begin with, a landless younger son has zero chance of ever starting a family.
Right. The economic threshold to secure a wife, the bride wealth, was simply out of reach for a younger son with no inheritance. So in that specific societal framework, embarking on a dangerous maritime raid transitions from an act of reckless violence to a highly calculated economic decision.
It's just survival at that point.
Yeah, it became the only viable mechanism for a disenfranchised man to accumulate the silver and portable wealth necessary to return home, purchase land, secure a wife, and establish a household. It was a desperate bid for social survival.
So the pressure cooker has exploded. We have disenfranchised elites and desperate, landless younger sons pushed out onto the sea. But that really only explains the push. It doesn't explain the pull. I mean, why specifically target Western Europe and the British Isles? They could have just fought each other or sailed east into the Baltic.
Well, they did do that too, but there had to be a magnet directing all this violent energy specifically toward the Anglo-Saxons. And that magnet was the economic boom of what historians refer to as the long 8th century. The global economy was shifting in a massive way.
How so?
Well, the Islamic world was expanding rapidly, and its vast trade networks were pushing unprecedented amounts of wealth, particularly silver, northward through the river systems of Eastern Europe and right into Scandinavia.
Which means the Scandinavians were already deeply plugged into a globalized commercial network long before they ever attacked a monastery.
Exactly. They weren't isolated barbarians at the edge of the world. They were active participants in international trade. They were acutely aware of where the wealth was concentrating. And through these trade networks, they gathered intelligence on the emerging economies of Western Europe.
Right. In Anglo-Saxon England, you have these proto-urban trade centers flourishing. These were the witch towns, places like Londonwick, which is modern London, and Eoforwick, which eventually became York.
And furthermore, the British Isles and the Frankish realms were home to incredibly wealthy coastal monasteries. These monasteries functioned essentially as the banks of the medieval world. They were hoarding gold, silver, and jewels in the form of religious relics.
Okay, here is where the traditional narrative requires some pushback. Because if the Scandinavians were already trading and the wealth of the coastal monasteries had been sitting there for decades, why wait until the very end of the 8th century to attack? I mean, why didn't they raid Lindisfarne in the year 700?
That is a great point. It was really a convergence of capability and opportunity. The capability came from a massive leap in maritime technology. The perfection of the broad-beamed, shallow draft sailing ship, the iconic longship, that allowed them to cross open oceans rapidly and still navigate incredibly shallow river systems.
And the opportunity.
The opportunity arose from the deep political fracturing of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms.
So the pressure cooker finally met the magnet. And that brings us back to the shores of Wessex in 789 and that royal tax collector, Bedford. This vignette from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles just perfectly illustrates the disconnect between the two cultures at the exact moment of first contact.
It really does. Bedford was a royal reeve based in Dorchester. His administrative duty was to monitor the coastline and enforce the king's trade regulations.
Just doing his job.
Right. So when he saw 3 ships from Hordaland, which is modern-day Norway, arrive on the Isle of Portland, he operated entirely within the framework of a functioning bureaucratic state.
He rode out expecting them to be merchants. He likely commanded them to follow him to the royal manor to pay their customs duties. I mean, he literally tried to tax an invasion force.
And the Norsemen responded to his bureaucratic demands with lethal force. They killed him and his men on the spot. Bedford approached them with paperwork, essentially, and they answered with iron.
That is striking. It vividly demonstrates that the local authorities possessed no conceptual category for unprovoked secular violence from the sea. They just assumed everyone operating in their waters played by the established rules of commerce.
Yeah, the death of one reeve in Wessex was a localized tragedy, but it was merely a reconnaissance mission. The event that shattered the psychological security of the entire Christian West occurred 4 years later, on June 8th, 793.
The attack on the monastery of Lindisfarne.
Exactly. Lindisfarne was a center of immense wealth and learning off the northeastern coast of Northumbria. It housed the revered relics of St. Cuthbert.
What really stands out in the source material regarding Lindisfarne is the sheer, cold calculation of the attack. They didn't just randomly stumble upon an island, they weaponized local intelligence.
Oh, absolutely. The raiders relied on the information networks established by their own merchants. They knew the coastal geography intimately, but more importantly, they understood the liturgical calendar.
Right. They deliberately timed their assault to coincide with a major church festival. They knew the religious community would be entirely absorbed in their observances. completely undefended, with all their most valuable silver and gold chalices brought out for the ceremonies.
It was ruthless efficiency. They slaughtered the monks, took captives to sell into slavery, stripped the altars of their precious metals, and just sailed away before any local militia could even be raised.
And to comprehend the true impact of the Lindisfarne raid, we really have to analyze the reaction of the Anglo-Saxon and Carolingian intellectual elite, because the victims lacked the secular geopolitical vocabulary to explain what had just happened.
No, they couldn't perceive the Norsemen as disenfranchised chieftains, driven by demographic pressures and an operational sex ratio imbalance. That framework didn't exist for them.
They perceived them as monsters sent by God.
Yeah, the prevailing framework was strictly theological. Alcuin of York, who was one of the foremost scholars of the era serving at the court of Charlemagne, he articulated this perfectly. He wrote these extensive letters, framing the destruction of Lindisfarne not as a military failure, but as a divine judgment.
He explicitly utilized biblical prophecy, right? Quoting the book of Jeremiah saying, "Out of the north shall evil break forth."
He did. And it's crucial we neutrally unpack this perspective.
Yeah.
Because for Alcuin and the surviving clerics, these were not men seeking bride wealth. They were the physical manifestation of God's wrath, sent to punish the Anglo-Saxons for their moral failings.
And in a way, this theological interpretation provided a strange sort of psychological comfort, didn't it? If the raids were a punishment for sin, the solution was straightforward. It was repentance, prayer, and moral reform.
Right. But the tragedy of that worldview is that moral reform offers no defense against a shallow draft-long ship. The raids relentlessly continued. They struck Monk, Wearmouth, Jarrow, Iona, and just kept tearing through the undefended coastlines.
However, as lucrative as these hit-and-run tactics were, they presented a severe logistical bottleneck for the raiders.
Yeah, they really did.
Because I see the bottleneck clearly. You load your ships with men, sail across the treacherous North Sea, hit a monastery, load up the silver and captives, and then you have to race back across the ocean before the autumn storms make the sea impassable. It's incredibly inefficient. The wealth you can extract is strictly limited by the cargo capacity of your ships and the short window of summer weather.
The strategic minds among the Norse forces recognized this inefficiency early on. To maximize resource extraction, they had to eliminate the perilous commute. And this realization led to the next major tactical evolution in the conflict. By the 840s, the fleets just stopped sailing home for the winter.
They decided to stay.
Yeah, they stayed. And that decision permanently altered the landscape of the British Isles. They began constructing fortified winter encampments. The Irish annals refer to these as long forts.
And the establishment of the long forts at Dublin and Ennigassen in 841 demonstrates a really sophisticated understanding of military geography, because the Norse utilized the unique engineering of their ships. A longship draws only a few feet of water, so it can bypass heavily fortified coastal areas and penetrate deep into the interior via river networks.
Ennigassen, or Lindusfjell as it was known, is a textbook example of this strategy. They sailed upriver and found a location where two rivers converged, featuring a naturally defensible D-shaped island.
They essentially used the existing river system as a massive ready-made moat.
Exactly. And overwintering completely dismantled the existing defensive strategies of the local populations. Previously, an Anglo-Saxon or Irish king knew he only had to maintain his coastal watch during the summer sailing season. Once autumn arrived, the threat just vanished.
But the long forts meant the Norse were now a permanent year-round fixture. They could safely stockpile plundered wealth. They could hold human captives indefinitely until slave traders arrived.
And crucially, it allowed them to launch devastating inland offensives during the dead of winter. They could march out of their long forts in January, striking when the local agricultural communities were hunkered down, completely dispersed, and entirely incapable of raising a defensive army.
We can visualize the sheer scale and complexity of these wintering strategies by examining the archaeological record, right? At sites like Torksey in Lincolnshire, England. Torksey served as a massive winter camp for the Viking armies in the late 860s. The material culture recovered from the soil there is just extraordinary.
It really is. The sources detail the specific footprint of the Torksey camp, and the best analogy I can construct is a muddy music festival field.
A music festival field.
Yeah, imagine tens of thousands of people camping in a confined space for an entire winter. They are repairing gear, trading, melting down metal, and living their daily lives in this muddy camp. Inevitably, things get dropped in the mud, and over months, a highly specific layer of trash and lost items is trampled into the earth. It leaves a distinct signature for modern archaeologists to read.
That makes perfect sense. And the specific items found in that mud tell a story of global commerce and brutal pragmatism. Archaeologists have recovered clipped silver dirhams originally minted in the Islamic world, which demonstrates that the men camped in Lincolnshire were directly participating in trade networks extending all the way to Baghdad and Samarkand.
They found gold ingots, too, and vast quantities of lead weights.
Those lead weights are the vital clue, right? They
Yeah.
indicate a society operating on a bullion economy rather than minted currency. We also see chopped up Anglo-Saxon strap ends and decorative metalwork.
Right. The hacked-up metalwork is known as hack silver. When you operate a bullion economy, the aesthetic or religious value of an object is completely irrelevant. An intricately carved Anglo-Saxon cross or a beautiful belt buckle simply represents raw weight to them.
So they would literally chop these items into pieces to achieve the exact weight of silver required for a transaction, measuring it out on portable folding scales using those lead weights.
Exactly. And this transition from seasonal raiders extracting wealth to massive permanent camps engaged in global trade set the stage for an entirely new phase of the conflict.
Wow.
By 865, the operational scope shifted from raiding for portable wealth to a highly coordinated campaign of territorial conquest.
And the arrival of the Great Heathen Army in 865 really marks this escalation. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles use the term mycel here, the Great Army. This was not a localized fleet of disparate raiders. It was a massive coalition of seasoned Scandinavian warriors operating under joint command.
The leadership included legendary figures such as Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Uba.
And to comprehend how this coalition managed to dismantle the existing power structures so rapidly, we have to look at the vulnerability of the target. We casually use the term England today, but in 865, England did not exist.
No, the political reality was a deeply fractured heptarchy. It was primarily dominated by four rival Anglo-Saxon kingdoms: Wessex in the southwest, Mercia occupying the Midlands, Northumbria dominating the north, and East Anglia on the eastern coast.
And these kingdoms were perpetually locked in border conflicts, ideological disputes, and internal dynastic struggles over succession. They were actively trying to destroy each other at the exact moment a unified veteran invasion force landed on their shores.
Right. The Viking commanders were exceptional strategists who recognized and ruthlessly exploited this internal disunity. The Great Heathen Army rarely faced a combined Anglo-Saxon resistance. They would isolate one kingdom, launch a devastating attack, and simultaneously negotiate peace treaties or accept tribute from the neighboring kingdoms, ensuring the Anglo-Saxons remained divided.
The capture of York in 866 is the masterclass in the strategic exploitation, isn't it? York was the capital of Northumbria, a massive, heavily fortified former Roman city, but the Viking commanders didn't launch a grueling months-long siege. They utilized their understanding of the local culture again.
They launched their assault on November 1st, All Saints' Day.
A paramount religious holiday.
Exactly. The Northumbrian nobility and leadership were concentrated in the city, entirely focused on religious ceremonies. And they were deeply embroiled in a bitter civil war between two rival claimants to the throne, King Ewella and Osber.
So the element of surprise was total. They breached the city defenses while the leadership was distracted, effectively seizing the capital of the north in a single stroke and forcing the rival kings to flee.
And then they subsequently installed a puppet king, a local Anglo-Saxon named Egbert, to extract taxes and manage the local population on their behalf while the army moved on to its next target. It was a highly sophisticated model of imperial conquest.
But this raises a massive analytical question. If the Great Heathen Army possessed overwhelming numerical superiority, possessed superior mobility, and consistently outmaneuvered the fractured Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, why did the conquest stop? I mean, why didn't they take Wessex and claim the entire island?
The momentum halted because of a fundamental shift in the objectives of the Viking leadership. A coalition army only remains unified as long as the goals of its commanders align. Between 874 and 876, the Great Heathen Army fractured from within.
Because the goals shifted from acquiring portable wealth to acquiring real estate.
Exactly. The commander Halfdan recognized that decades of campaigning yield diminishing returns. The undefended wealth had largely been extracted, so he took a massive contingent of the army north, into Northumbria, and towards Scotland. His focus transitioned entirely to settlement. The sources state he shared out the land of the Northumbrians, and they proceeded to plow and to support themselves.
Veteran soldiers laid down their axes and took up the plow.
Yeah. Meanwhile, the remaining forces, under the command of a leader named Guthrum, turned south to execute the final phase of the conquest, the destruction of Wessex. But Guthrum was now operating with a significantly depleted force. He no longer commanded the overwhelming numbers that had terrified the other kingdoms.
And that internal division provided the King of Wessex, Alfred, who would eventually earn the title Alfred the Great, with the critical breathing room necessary to survive. Alfred was a visionary military reformer. He utilized the reprieve to completely overhaul the defensive infrastructure of his kingdom.
He recognized that the traditional Anglo-Saxon method of raising a local militia, the Fyrd, was simply too slow to react to the speed of a Viking longship fleet.
So Alfred instituted a standing rotational army, ensuring a portion of his forces was always mobilized and ready to respond. But more importantly, he engineered the Burhole system. He constructed a vast network of fortified garrison towns, burhs positioned strategically along rivers and ancient road networks.
Right. If a Viking fleet sailed up a river in Wessex, their progress was physically blocked by a fortified bridge, and they were immediately engaged by a permanent garrison. Alfred negated their primary advantage, mobility.
And this systemic reorganization culminated in the Battle of Edington in 878, where Alfred's forces decisively defeated Guthrum's army. So what does this all mean?
Well, Wessex survived. The total conquest of the island failed.
But the geopolitical reality was forever altered. The outcome wasn't a retreat by the Vikings, it was a permanent partition.
Yes. Following a subsequent treaty between Alfred and Guthrum in 886, the boundaries were formalized. The massive territory encompassing the north and east of England became a distinct political and cultural zone known as the Danelaw, or Danelage in Old English.
The Law of the Danes. And this wasn't merely a line drawn on a map to delineate borders, it was a fundamentally different jurisdictional zone where Scandinavian legal traditions, social structures, and economic models were deeply embedded into the daily lives of the population.
To comprehend the mechanics of the Danelaw, we really must analyze the legal texts of the era. Most notably, the Wantage Code, also referred to as the Third Ethelred Code. Although issued later, it meticulously codifies the established customs of the region.
Okay, let's unpack this legal structure. Because how did a warrior culture transition into a civilian administration? The foundational unit of local government in the Danelaw provides a major clue. It was called the wapentake.
The term wapentake is derived directly from the Old Norse vopnatak,
Right.
which literally translates to the taking of weapons. It served the same administrative function as the Anglo-Saxon hundred, which was a subdivision of a shire used for taxation and legal assembly. The terminology itself reveals the societal origin.
It's the physical act of men at an assembly clashing or brandishing their spears and swords to signal their collective assent to a legal ruling or a leader's decision. It is the literal echo of a military camp assembly transitioning into a permanent civilian court.
Yeah, the laws enforced within the wapentake contain distinct mechanisms entirely foreign to traditional Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence. The most prominent feature was the overwhelming reliance on heavy financial penalties to resolve disputes. The texts detail the lawslit, a specific severe cash fine levied for breaches of the peace within the Danelaw.
But the mechanism that truly highlights the economic disparity of this system is the concept of lockup.
Lockup translates to the purchasing of law. It allowed an individual who had committed a severe offense or who had been stripped of their legal standing to literally buy back their legal rights and re-enter society by paying a massive sum of silver.
I look at lockup and I see a direct parallel to modern corporate fines. If an incredibly wealthy corporation violates an environmental regulation and the penalty is a flat fine, the fine isn't a deterrent. It's simply the cost of doing business.
That's a great way to think about it.
If a wealthy Anglo-Scandinavian elite in the Danelaw commits a crime, they possess the silver to utilize lockup. They simply buy their way out of the consequences.
The legal framework heavily insulated the wealthy. We have to remember the economic context here. The Danelaw was experiencing a massive influx of wealth driven by the Scandinavian trade networks. It operated on a dual currency system, utilizing both minted coins and raw bullion. Wealth was highly concentrated among the new aristocracy. A justice system predicated on exorbitant cash fines inherently serves to protect those who control the cash flow, while devastating the lower classes who cannot afford to buy the law.
It's a remarkably transactional approach to justice. But the legal texts also reveal that going to court was often the absolute last resort, right?
Yes, the Scandinavian cultural tradition exhibited a profound preference for informal, private dispute resolution, which they termed love, over the formal application of law.
They preferred to settle it out of court.
Exactly. The formal legal proceedings at the wapentake were viewed as cumbersome, unpredictable, and potentially humiliating. Similar to the societal dynamics we see documented in the Icelandic sagas, the community strongly preferred that disputing parties negotiate privately, establish a financial compensation for the grievance, and restore social harmony without state intervention.
So, the draconian fines of the formal law often serve merely as a terrifying deterrent, coercing individuals into accepting a private settlement.
Right. But if someone shattered the peace and a private settlement couldn't be reached, the enforcement mechanism of the Danelaw was incredibly brutal. It utilized a system of communal liability.
And traditional Anglo-Saxon law often tied liability to the immediate kinship group or family, but the Danelaw introduced territorial communal liability on a massive scale. If an individual broke the king's peace, the penalty was not solely levied on the perpetrator. The Wantage Code stipulates instances where the fine was exacted from 12 entire local units, 1200s.
The psychological pressure of that system is staggering. If a rogue element in your village commits violence, the central authority doesn't just hunt down the individual. They bankrupt the entire region.
It weaponizes peer pressure. It forces every neighbor, every farmer, and every local leader to actively monitor and police their own communities to protect their collective wealth.
It is the strict, uncompromising discipline of a military regiment applied directly to civilian landholding. And to facilitate this community policing, the Danelaw formalized the role of local juries.
The Wantage Code outlines the assembly of 12 leading thegns, local nobles within each wapentake.
Now, these are not juries in the modern sense, sitting in a courtroom weighing forensic evidence to determine guilt or innocence.
No, they functioned as juries of presentment. Their duty was to swear an oath on sacred relics that they would neither conceal a guilty man nor accuse an innocent one. They were required to present to the court the names of individuals within their community who were deemed untrustworthy or who were consistently suspected of criminal behavior.
It was an intelligence-gathering mechanism based entirely on local reputation and gossip. The state relied on the local elites to identify the troublemakers. This entire legal framework fundamentally rewired the social structure of Eastern England. But the Scandinavian influence wasn't confined to the island of Great Britain. If we look across the Irish Sea, the impact was arguably even more revolutionary.
Oh, without a doubt. The transformation of Ireland during the Viking Age is centered entirely on the evolution of Dublin. We established earlier that Dublin originated in 841 as a fortified winter camp built to protect ships. But it rapidly outgrew its military origins. It exploded into a sprawling, densely populated proto-urban kingdom.
It became the economic engine of the Irish Sea, and it achieved that status by becoming the premier slave port in Western Europe.
Yeah, the economic paradigm shift the Norse introduced to Ireland is profound. Prior to their arrival, the indigenous Irish economy was almost entirely rural and kin-based. Wealth was measured in agricultural terms. The standard unit of value in exchange was cattle.
There were no minted coins, no urban commercial centers, and no concept of weight-based currency.
Right. The Vikings arrived and forcibly integrated this rural cattle economy into a global bullion network. And the material culture excavated from Viking Age Dublin confirms this transformation completely. Archaeologists have recovered thousands of lead weights and intricately crafted folding bronze scales from the graves of the Norse settlers.
These tools were the lifeblood of their identity. The process of commerce was entirely tactile. If you wanted to purchase goods, you didn't hand over a stamped coin with an agreed-upon value. You placed your goods on the scale, and the merchant placed pieces of silver on the other side until the weights balanced.
And that silver rarely took the form of intact jewelry or pristine coins. They utilized hack silver. A merchant would take an intricately woven silver arm ring, place it on an anvil, and physically chop it into fragments with a chisel to generate the precise weight required for a transaction. The aesthetics of the object were annihilated in favor of its base metallurgical value.
But the primary commodity generating mountains of hack silver in Dublin wasn't timber or textiles. It was human lives.
The transatlantic and trans-European slave trade was the bedrock of Dublin's phenomenal wealth. The Norse fleets launched relentless raids across the Irish interior, the coasts of Britain, and as far afield as the Iberian Peninsula, capturing thousands of individuals. These captives were funneled back into the holding pens of Dublin.
From the docks of Dublin, these human beings were sold into massive international distribution networks, eventually being transported deep into Moorish Spain, the Mediterranean, and the vast slave markets of the Byzantine Empire. It is a grim historical reality.
It really is. However, the prolonged interaction between the Norse in Dublin and the indigenous Irish population evolved far beyond a simple dichotomy of brutal invader and victimized defender. The political reality on the ground rapidly developed into a complex system of cultural hybridity.
Yeah, they started fighting each other, but they quickly realized they could use each other. The Irish political landscape was just as fractured as the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy, with dozens of provincial kings constantly vying for the title of High King.
These Irish kings were exceptionally pragmatic. They recognized that the Norse long forts contained thousands of heavily armed, battle-hardened veteran mercenaries who possessed fleets of ships capable of rapid deployment.
So rather than endlessly besieging Dublin, Irish kings began hiring Norse fleets to attack their indigenous Irish political rivals.
Exactly. The Norse mercenaries became the decisive weapon in Irish civil wars. And this military cooperation inevitably bled into social integration. The integration occurred at the highest echelons of power. The Norse elite of Dublin and the various Irish royal dynasties actively cemented their military alliances through strategic intermarriage.
And this blending created an entirely new, powerful demographic group known as the Norse Gaels. They were bilingual, bicultural aristocrats who navigated both the intricate kin politics of Ireland and the maritime commercial networks of the Scandinavian world.
The existence of the Norse Gaels forces us to completely reevaluate the major military conflicts of the era in Ireland. The popular historical memory often flattens these events into simple nationalistic narratives. The Battle of Clontarf in 1014 is the prime example of this.
Right. The myth portrays Clontarf as a glorious, unified ethnic uprising, where the indigenous Irish, led by the High King Brian Boru, finally united to drive the foreign Viking invaders into the sea.
But the contemporary sources dismantle that mythology entirely. The reality of Clontarf reveals a deeply complex regional power struggle driven by dynastic ambition. The High King Brian Boru did not lead a pure Irish army. His forces heavily featured Norse Gaelic allies from the rival Viking settlement of Limerick, fighting fiercely on his behalf.
And the forces opposing him were equally hybridized. The King of Leinster, an indigenous Irish ruler, initiated the rebellion against Brian Boru. To bolster his forces, the King of Leinster allied himself with the Norse King of Dublin, Sihtric Silkenbeard, who subsequently called in Viking mercenaries from the Isle of Man and the Orkneys.
The battlefield at Clontarf was not a clash of two distinct races. It was a chaotic melee where Irishmen and Vikings stood shoulder to shoulder fighting against an opposing shield wall comprised of Irishmen and Vikings. The allegiances were dictated by immediate political necessity and family ties, not by ethnic origins.
When cultures trade humans, silver, and military force for over a century, the boundaries between them dissolve. You stop seeing an occupier and an occupied, and you start seeing an entirely new hybrid society. And that blending is permanently recorded in the linguistic and physical footprint they left behind.
The linguistic evidence provides a precise map of where the Norse exerted the most influence. Because the Norse introduced advanced maritime technology and commercial structures to Ireland, the Old Irish language absorbed numerous Norse loan words specifically related to those fields.
For instance, the Old Norse word for a small cargo-carrying boat, natterbarki, was assimilated directly into Irish vocabulary as a knatterbark. They literally gave them the words for their new economy.
Yeah. But in England, the cultural footprint is etched in stone, particularly when we examine the intersection of religion. The Christianization of the Danelaw is one of the most compelling examples of organic cultural blending in European history.
Because when the Great Heathen Army conquered eastern England, they systematically dismantled the institutional framework of the Anglo-Saxon Church. The monasteries were sacked, the bishops fled or were killed, and the centralized, top-down enforcement of Christian dogma collapsed entirely in the region.
But the peasant class, the local Anglo-Saxon farmers, they remained, and they were still Christian. They found themselves living alongside an influx of pagan Scandinavian settlers. Because there was no ecclesiastical hierarchy dictating strict rules, the conversion of the Norse settlers happened from the ground up, neighbor to neighbor.
And this lack of rigid oversight allowed for a profound religious syncretism, a seamless blending of Christian theology with deeply held Norse mythology.
The Gosforth Cross, located in Cumbria, is the ultimate physical manifestation of this syncretism. It's a massive, intricately carved stone cross, undeniably a Christian monument intended for worship.
But when you examine the carvings on the shaft of the cross, the imagery is just breathtakingly hybrid. Carved directly alongside the traditional Christian depiction of the crucifixion are vivid, chaotic scenes depicting Ragnarok, the apocalyptic end of the world in Norse mythology.
You have Christ on the cross on one side, and on the other you have the Norse god Vidar tearing the jaws of the giant wolf Fenrir apart. The artisans who carved the Gosforth cross were not experiencing cognitive dissonance. To a newly converted Anglo-Scandinavian, the sacrifice of Christ and the cosmic battle of Ragnarok were not mutually exclusive concepts, they were parallel truths.
The cross visually represents their attempt to reconcile the ancestral myths of their homeland with the new faith of their adopted soil. It's a peaceful blending. But the archaeology also forces us to confront the brutal, unyielding pagan reality of their initial arrival. We have to examine the excavations at the Repton charnel house in Derbyshire.
Repton is a site of immense historical significance. It's the documented location where the Great Heathen Army established their winter camp in 873. And Repton was not a random location. It was the site of an incredibly important Mercian royal monastery. It housed the mausoleum of the Mercian royal family.
When modern archaeologists excavated the site, they uncovered a deliberate, highly symbolic act of desecration and dominance.
The Viking forces took the existing Christian crypt containing the Mercian kings and physically incorporated it into a massive, newly constructed pagan burial mound. They buried 264 individuals within this structure.
And the vast majority were robust, adult males exhibiting signs of violent trauma, the casualties of the Great Heathen Army. But the forensic analysis revealed a darker element among the remains. The archaeologists found the bodies of children and a teenager interred alongside the warriors.
The positioning and context of those younger remains strongly indicate they were not casualties of war, but rather sacrificial victims. They were ritually killed to consecrate the pagan burial mound, ensuring the fallen warriors were accompanied into the afterlife according to strict Norse religious protocols.
Building a pagan sacrificial mound directly on top of the sacred Christian burial site of the conquered Mercian kings was a calculated physical assertion of total ideological and territorial supremacy.
Just down the road from Repton is another site that provides a completely different, almost poignant view of the invasion logistics, the Heathwood Cremation Cemetery.
Heathwood is utterly unique. It is the only known large-scale Viking cremation cemetery in the British Isles, containing 59 burial mounds. The Norse practice of cremation involves burning the deceased on a pyre at extremely high temperatures, leaving behind only calcined bone fragments.
And this is where the cutting-edge science intersects with the historical narrative. Scientists perform strontium isotope analysis on those tiny fragments of burnt bone. I want to slow down and explain the mechanics of how this works because it's a brilliant piece of detective work.
Yeah, please do.
Strontium is a naturally occurring trace element found in rocks and soil. As water flows through the earth, it picks up the strontium, which then enters the local food chain. When a human or an animal drinks the water or eats the plants from a specific area, the strontium physically replaces the calcium in their developing bones and tooth enamel.
Because the geological age and composition of the rocks vary dramatically across different regions of the world, the ratio of strontium isotopes creates a distinct geographic signature.
Exactly. A tooth effectively becomes a permanent geological passport, recording exactly where that individual lived during the years their teeth were forming. When the scientists analyzed the strontium signatures from the remains at Heathwood, the results definitively proved that several of the adult humans buried in those mounds possessed isotopic signatures matching the geology of the Baltic Shield in Scandinavia.
They were first-generation immigrants who had crossed the North Sea. But the analysis didn't stop with the humans. They tested the animal bones recovered from the same cremation pyres, and the results showed that the animals also possessed the Scandinavian strontium signature.
They identified the remains of domesticated dogs and horses. This data forces us to revise our understanding of the invasion logistics. The Great Heathen Army did not simply sail to England and steal local horses. These warriors loaded their personal prized hunting dogs and their war horses onto those shallow-draft, open-decked longships and transported them across the freezing, turbulent waters of the North Sea.
The effort and risk required to transport a terrified horse across the ocean in an open boat is monumental. It demonstrates the profound emotional and cultural value they placed on these specific animals. They weren't just livestock, they were vital companions in life, essential for hunting and warfare, and they were deemed necessary companions for the journey into the afterlife.
It grounds the grand, sweeping narrative of invasion into deeply personal, individual realities. It makes them vividly human.
Speaking of the personal details, the contemporary sources provide fascinating observations regarding their physical appearance. The Anglo-Saxon observers noted that the Norsemen cultivated very specific, highly recognizable hairstyles.
The visual distinction was intentional. The texts describe the Norsemen shaving the entire back of their heads and their necks completely bare, while allowing the hair on the front and top of their heads to grow exceedingly long, often sweeping it over their eyes.
They essentially invaded England sporting aggressive reverse mullets.
Yeah, pretty much. And it stood in stark visual contrast to the Anglo-Saxon nobility, who traditionally wore their hair long and untrimmed all over as a symbol of their status. The haircut was a deliberate, tribal uniform, an immediate visual signifier of their distinct identity in a contested landscape.
We have traced this massive footprint, the demographic pressures, the establishment of the Danelaw, the bullion economy of Dublin, the hybrid monuments, and the very bones left in the soil. But as we approach the 11th century, the geopolitical landscape shifts again. We must examine how this era of dominant Scandinavian influence eventually concludes.
The traditional historical timeline places the definitive end of the Viking Age in England in the year 1066 at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. In September of 1066, the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada launched a massive final attempt to conquer England, leading a fleet of hundreds of ships. He advanced into Yorkshire, where he was intercepted at Stamford Bridge by the mobilized forces of the Anglo-Saxon king Harold Godwinson.
And the Anglo-Saxons achieved a decisive, crushing victory. Harald Hardrada was killed, his army was annihilated, and the survivors required only a fraction of their original fleet to flee back to Norway. It effectively terminated the era of large-scale Scandinavian incursions into the British Isles.
But this seemingly definitive conclusion introduces a final, lingering realization regarding the cyclical nature of history and migration. Because the Anglo-Saxon army achieved a monumental triumph at Stamford Bridge. However, the effort required a brutal, forced march to the north and a grueling, horrific melee. The army was completely exhausted.
They won the battle, but they destroyed their own operational capacity in the process.
Yes. Less than a month later, that same battered, depleted Anglo-Saxon army was forced to march hundreds of miles back south to the coast of Sussex. They had to confront an entirely separate invasion force at the Battle of Hastings.
The invasion led by William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy. And at Hastings, the exhausted Anglo-Saxons were decisively defeated. King Harold Godwinson was killed, and the Anglo-Saxon era ended.
The irony is profound when we examine the lineage of the victors. The region of Normandy in northern France had been formally granted to a group of Viking settlers, the Northmen, over a century earlier, by the French king, specifically to stop them from raiding Paris.
So William the Conqueror, the man who finally conquered England, was the great-great-great-grandson of Rollo, a Viking raider.
Exactly.
We started this deep dive talking about the expectation of clean lines on a map. You look at 1066 and you try to draw a line that says, here ends the Viking Age and here begins the Norman era. But the line dissolves. The ultimate conquest of England wasn't the end of the Viking story. It was merely the final victory by a different, French-speaking, heavily armored group of Viking descendants over the descendants of the Anglo-Saxons and the inhabitants of the Danelaw. The cultural DNA of the region wasn't erased. It just rearranged itself one more time.
It is a profound reminder that history rarely provides us with clean endings. It only provides continuous transformations.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.